All right, 2015 exam, people. 2015 exam. Look, this might be the hardest one yet. It very well could be because the fact of the matter is, it's quite difficult picking out, I think, for a lot of students, what exactly the disagreement is between Stephanie Bennett and Matthew Nguyen. And it's quite a subtle disagreement, but there is a big disagreement. And I think if you don't diagnose it, it could be very hard to analyze or to do comparative on these two articles. So, what exactly is a disagreement, or as I like to say, the topic of concern? Remember the fact that all essays must start with a topic of concern. All language analysis comparative essays must start with a topic of concern. And for many people, that is just simply the contextual statement. But basically, it says something along the lines of what the debate is between the two. So here's an essay I quickly just wrote then. And I've diagnosed the topic of concern as the following. The topic of concern between the two texts is whether volunteering is an extraordinary act or merely part of being a decent human being. Now, if you were to read Matthew Nguyen's response, you might be tempted to conclude that he doesn't really disagree with much from Stephanie Bennett. He thinks volunteering is great. She thinks volunteering is great. But if you were to reach that conclusion, you would have failed to consider that there is a radical difference. And it is radical in the sense that Stephanie Bennett is contending that volunteers are like heroes. They're heroic. Whereas Matthew Nguyen is contending that volunteers are just normal people. And the act of volunteering is not some heroic deed, it's just what a decent human being should do. So, what's the relationship then between these two texts? Well, the second text, Matthew Nguyen's text, downplays the importance of that Stephanie Bennett places on volunteering, downplays it, undermines it. Very important to diagnose that relationship because it makes doing this comparative a lot easier. It also makes figuring out their kind of respective contentions a lot easier. So let's have a look at their respective contentions. We've done the topic of concern statement, which I will remind all of you, this can just be replicated throughout all of your essays. The topic of concern between the two texts or the three texts is blah, and you just say what the kind of general debate is. And you know that when you write the topic of concern, that one writer will fall on one side of the debate, of the topic of concern, and the other will fall on the other side. So, which side does Stephanie Bennett fall on? Does she think volunteering is an extraordinary act or merely part of being a decent human being? Well, she thinks it's an extraordinary act. So, you write that. In a speech to volunteer groups and distinguished players in Australian society, CEO Big Splash. Remember, always say their title, always say what the format is. It's a speech. Stephanie Bennett contends volunteering is an extraordinary act. Very simple. This is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a 5-word contention. That's all you need. Too many times I see grade students unnecessarily putting in reasons why the contention is true in the introduction. That's totally irrelevant to what's required of you, which is simply to diagnose the underlying contention, fundamental argument of the piece, not to give reasons why the argument is true. Why? Because you're supposed to analyze the reasons why the argument is true, the persuasive techniques, and so forth in your actual analysis. This is where the analysis of the reasons comes into play. And arguably, mentioning them in your introduction is redundant. And what that means is it won't take marks away. I mean, I myself used to do it in year 12, and a lot of really good students do this. They put too much in their introduction. It won't take marks away, but it will slow you down. And if you slow down, you can't write as much. And if you can't write as much, then actually maybe it will take marks away from you, since you have less opportunity to show yourself off. So keep that in mind. The contention is always very simple. Now, what's the contention of Matthew Nguyen? Well, he falls on the other side of the debate in receiving the 2015 Australian Volunteers Award from Bennett. So again, you're just identifying the relationship between the two texts. Bennett is awarding an award. Matthew Newen is receiving the award from Bennett. Matthew Bennett, local tradie, that's his title, contends volunteering is merely part of being a decent human being. Simple. Except that there is also this second kind of contention Bennett has. You might call it an ulterior contention, namely that Big Splash is a dedicated supporter of volunteering. And I'll talk about that when we go into analysis. But briefly, the point is that Bennett spends a fair amount of time mentioning Big Splash, telling the audience that Big Splash cares about volunteers, telling the audience how Big Splash has contributed to supporting volunteers. I mean, this whole first paragraph is about Big Splash and how Big Splash basically loves volunteers and supports them. So there is the sense that Bennett is trying to persuade us of something. Anytime you see an argument taking up such a significant part of text, it suggests that it might be kind of one of the fundamental motivations. Given that, with most articles, there's only going to be one contention. So this is the exception to the rule. You shouldn't be constituting your introduction with multiple kind of overarching arguments. Generally, there should only be one. This is the exception. All right. So let's move on to the analysis and we can start to flesh out how the writer advances the contention. So, in calling volunteers heroic, Bennett attempts to define the concept of volunteering in several ways. So, it's just important to recognize that when Bennett says volunteers and their organizations are heroic, she's actually defining what they mean to us. She's actually instilling them with a meaning that perhaps they didn't already have for us, for the target audience. And that is this idea that somehow volunteers are heroic. And it's kind of almost like an odd thing to say. So what does this term suggest? What does heroic suggest? Well, as always, what I tell students is break things down. So there are many different suggestions of heroic, of what a hero is. You know, courage, having extraordinary powers of some sort. You know, being extraordinary, out of the ordinary in some way. These aren't a singular idea. These are multiple strands. These are distinct ideas. So a good little thing can do is to just acknowledge, hey, there's not just one suggestion going on here. This doesn't just imply one thing. This implies multiple things, as I've done here. So I've broken it down first, second, and I think, do I do two or three? So first, the term suggests volunteers are not ordinary people, but rather, like heroes, are remarkable individuals with capacities not accessible by normal people. All right, that's the first suggestion. The second suggestion. The term plays on the traditional conception of heroes as brave and courageous. It therefore implies that volunteers perform a service that most do not have the gall or pluck to perform. So while the first suggestion says that volunteers kind of have these capacities that perhaps normal people don't. For after all, no one except Spider-Man can spin a web, really, or fly through the air like Superman. Superheroes have capacities, qualities that normal people don't. So in calling volunteers heroic, Bennett's implying that volunteers also have kind of inaccessible capacities. But also that volunteers are brave and courageous, which is the traditional idea of what a hero is. Third, since a hero is necessarily committed to advancing social justice, it follows that if volunteers are heroic, then they too are committed to advancing social justice. Right? A hero is not a villain. A hero stands for the good. So in calling volunteers heroes, Bennett is saying volunteers stand for the good too. So what does this imply? Well, this in turn implies that volunteers are remedying a social ill. So, what I mean by this is that if we lived in a utopian world, in a world of perfect social justice, then there wouldn't be any problems. There would be no social, there'd be nothing to advance. So, in saying that volunteers are actually advancing social justice, there's an implication that there are problems in society that volunteers are trying to solve, right? That volunteers are responding to. There are social ills that they are trying to remedy. And thus, that volunteers, are problem solvers, helping to ensure better lives for all. Thus, therefore, Bennett uses the connotations of a hero to define the meaning of volunteering to the audience, who may therefore be inclined to view volunteering as an extraordinary act. So, what I did in this paragraph is actually very simple. It was to go, okay, look, Bennett defines volunteers as heroic. Okay, what are all the suggestions of heroism? Well, I identified 3 suggestions. You might be able to think of even more. There are 3 suggestions there are 3 kind of characteristics of being a hero, which in turn suggest, which give connotations to the meaning of volunteering, that define volunteering. And so that therefore, the target audience, having had their concept of volunteering be defined in terms of heroism, they might be inclined to view volunteers as heroes. That is, as kind of extraordinary people, with volunteering being an extraordinary act. So the name of the game in language analysis is all about suggestion. What are the interesting suggestions you can pick out from pieces of language? A lot of the time, that kind of means having a quick little brainstorm. But that is the fundamental aspect of language analysis. All right, so moving on. Together, these suggestions of heroism function to portray volunteers as imperative to the well-being of society. Indeed, Bennett uses the counterfactual. Well, what would we do without them? So a counterfactual is just saying like, well, what if Hitler had not lost the Nazi wars? What if the Nazis had won? It's just pretending something happened that didn't happen. What would we do without them? To provoke. So she asks that question, what would we do without volunteers? Blah, 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 blah. She does it in this paragraph. What would we do without them? To provoke the audience to directly consider the important role volunteers play in their own lives. So when she asks that question, she kind of forces the audience to consider what role volunteers play. So therefore, the audience is invited to consider the point of view, since it's a question, and thus their response is kind of shaped by Bennett. Why is it shaped by Bennett? Well, Bennett proceeds to list a litany of examples intended to demonstrate the necessity of volunteering to Australian society. After all, volunteers solve medical problems, they help the elderly, yada, yada, yada. So what I'm saying here is Bennett does something clever. She asks a question. What would we do without them? But she doesn't just let the audience just sit there and wonder and potentially form their own opinion. She actually gives them the answer. So she invites them to get involved in the speech, and then she tells them what to think, essentially. Which is that, well, they've done heaps. They've helped all these people and blah, 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 blah. So what is the what is the persuasive value of this? Well, this strategy of uncovering potentially overlooked everyday acts that volunteers perform, right? The fact that they help at the beach, they help the elderly, etc., serves to position the audience to view volunteering as inextricably linked to the sustained well-being of society. So we're kind of reminded that, hey, volunteers, they're actually pretty important. I mean, what do all these examples suggest? Solving medical problems, helping the elderly, ensuring the cleanliness of the beach. These are all important aspects of our lives. The elderly are important. The beaches are important. Medicine is arguably the most important thing. So volunteers are all part of upholding those institutions or activities, and therefore they're linked, as those institutions are, to the sustained well-being of society. In fact, not only are volunteers imperative to society, they are a source of salvation, as signalled by life saver. Interesting. And secondly, by volunteers providing hope. So the first term suggests volunteers save physical lives, right? So in that sense, they're kind of force of salvation. For any members of the audience who consider the value of life important, such a suggestion directly implies volunteers perform a valuable service. So you see here that I've gone into the effect. I said it suggests volunteers save physical lives, lifesaver. And I've gone, well, look, what's the effect on the audience going to be? Well, for those members of the audience who consider the value of life important, such a suggestion directly implies volunteers are valuable. So it's always very important to segregate those members of the audience who you think, hypothetically, could be persuaded by what's being said. After all, not all people are persuaded by the same thing. The second term, hope, frames volunteers as enabling the spiritual sustenance of the Australian people, as they promulgate optimism and goodwill throughout society, once again affirming the special value of volunteering. So the first one, Lifesaver, focuses on salvation in terms of saving physical lives. The second focuses on salvation, hope, in terms of the spiritual lives. It enables volunteers, it implies volunteers are kind of enabling the spiritual sustenance. After all, hope is one of the essential life forces we have, the prospect of a better tomorrow. Without that prospect, there is no will to live. So, in suggesting that volunteers provide hope, we're saying that volunteers provide the will to live, in a way, the spiritual will, we might say. All right. So that's that. Anything I can say here? Not at the moment. We'll come back to it maybe. In any case, moving on. By describing Big Splash's support of volunteering as part of our corporate ethos, Bennett suggests volunteers are central, mistake, to her organization's values and outlooks. See, this, my friend, is why you got to check your writing, because you will make little mistake. You will make little mistakes. Okay. All right, so Bennett suggests volunteers are central to her organization's values and outlook. This suggestion, another one, is compounded by the sizable amount of the award. So now we're talking about her ulterior contention, that Big Splash supports volunteers. All right, so how does she advance this contention? Well, look, one way is the suggestion that they're part of the corporate ethos, which suggests that they're kind of central, they're massively important to the organization. And another way is this $100,000. That's a lot of money. So it highlights the scale of Big Splash's commitment and generosity in supporting volunteers. Further, what's another way? The metaphor of extending a helping hand suggests a personal and informal relationship between Big Splash and volunteers, downplaying the possible audience perception that Big Splash is just some faceless corporation making a tokenistic effort to support volunteers. Okay, so this is what you sometimes think a little bit outside the picture. This is a corporation speaking. Do we generally believe corporations in what they're saying all the time? And this sort of, not really, this sort of language extending a helping hand, perhaps it kind of personalizes Big Splash a bit, makes them seem a bit more human, that they're not just doing this for profit, but they actually really genuinely care about volunteers, and that therefore they are in fact a dedicated supporter of volunteers, which is what our contention is. So all of these first three factors, they all suggest ultimately that the Big Splash is in fact a dedicated supporter, which was what our contention was, of volunteering. They give a lot of money, Volunteering is part of their corporate ethos, and they actually have a personalized and informal relationship with volunteers, extending a helping hand. The picture plays into this as well. So the metaphor of extending hands is extended upon through the visualization of enjoining hands amidst a flowing arc of lines, which, reminiscent of an ocean wave, suggests a natural, fluid interaction between Big Splash and volunteers. Something's gone wrong here, and volunteers, thus depicting a harmonious relationship. So I'm saying that this visual, it directly builds upon what she writes in the article, extending helping hands. And the flowing arcs, the flowing lines are kind of reminiscent of an ocean wave. And what does this sort of imply? Well, it implies a kind of fluid, sort of harmonious relationship. Things are in harmony, they're flowing, curved, things are friendly. So in that way, the image is building upon the material in the text. Okay, going on. While Nguyen agrees, and I think actually stopping for a moment, I think that is all the analysis I do of this image. And the reason is because, look, you could talk about the Big Splash logo and how that suggests Big Splash does in fact support blah, blah, blah. And you could talk about how volunteers are bolded here to show that volunteers are important. And you could talk about the texts. I just thought the image was pretty boring, so I just didn't really bother that much with it. And considering the status of the image, how it's not a particularly provocative image, besides from this bit here. I mean, look, there is a lot you could sort of say about this, more than I did. But considering all that, I decided not to spend that much time on it. As long as you spend some time on it, and look, perhaps this was a little short. It was only a couple sentences. As long as you spend some time in it, then that's, yeah. Look, looking back on this now, I do think actually that was a little short. I should have analysed the picture a bit more. However, I don't think I'd be penalised. Yeah, but do analyse the picture more than I did. Okay, so going on. While Nguyen agrees with Bennett's emphasis on the importance of volunteers in society, then now we're talking about Bennett, noting his own organisation's roles in providing toilets to those in need. He rejects her argument that volunteers are extraordinary. Okay, so he agrees with her that volunteering is important, no doubt. And we know this because he kind of boasts about his own organisation and the efforts they're making. But he does disagree that they are extraordinary. So how does he do this? Well, it's achieved in several ways. First, he argues that volunteers merely perform what is expected of all citizens in a society, which is to help individuals in need. So volunteering isn't some unique, heroic act. It's what's expected of us as citizens. And he argues that through the language of decent human being. You have a right to expect someone, and yada, yada, yada. Thus, he positions volunteering as a duty, not a favour. You have the right to. That's what we're talking about here. So this repositions the audience to view volunteering as a necessary part of an individual's obligations to others, rather than an action of only a few exceptional individuals. So what might this mean? Well, it means it kind of subverts the Bennett's hero metaphor, does it not? It lowers volunteering from the realm of heroic to the realm of the decent human being. So this is where we need to think about perhaps the relationship between the two. If Bennett's saying that they're heroes, and then Nguyen's saying they're just decent, then he's undercutting the metaphor that she's used. That's not a particularly complicated thing to acknowledge, but it shows to your examiner that you've actually diagnosed the relationship between the two texts and how one might be reinforcing, or rather in this case, undermining the other. All right, second, Ewan's tone. Okay, I wrote this piece really quickly, and I'm reminded once again why I have to always check what I've written, because inevitably, and I tell my students all the time, you will make little silly mistakes like I have, and generally, two, small little things like missing an S or something, or a the missing, won't destroy your essay, but having too many will. So you've got to leave yourself time to go back and have a look at your essay. I wrote this piece very quickly, I think 30 odd minutes, 35. So I didn't bother to go back and look, and that's a mistake. So don't do that. In any case, second, Ewan's tone radically departs from Bennett's. So while Bennett uses use of tone is formal, we see this in the opening sort of remarks. This is kind of highly formalized. She's at a lectern. She's formal setting, distinguished guests, yada yada yada. In contrast, Nguyen's is informal. Cheers, everyone, he says, very informal. And he's more sober in his account of volunteering. He's not all hyped up about how great it is. So the effect is that Nguyen presents a more humble portrayal of what it means to volunteer. And his own admission that speaking isn't my strong point suggests nervousness and inability, which undermines Bennett's suggestion of volunteers as courageous and highly competent individuals. Right? So, what I'm saying here is not only is it the informal tone that kind of signals a more sober account of volunteering, but it's also this kind of his own admission. Speaking isn't my strong point. That undercuts it. Why? Because it suggests nervousness and inability. Right? Heroes typically aren't nervous, and in that way. So it suggests volunteers aren't heroes, essentially. That volunteers are just normal, everyday individuals is emphasized by the farmer shirts seen in the accompanying image. So now we get a bit of analysis. Actually, you know what? I might break this paragraph off. There we go. That volunteers is just normal. See, that's what you can do with language analysis. You can just break paragraphs off. You don't need to have rigid topic sentences. The goal is to analyze, and as long as things kind of connect and they flow a little bit, you don't need to worry about, okay, I've got this specific topic sentence and like in text response, and everything has to prove it, and blah blah blah. You can just decide, okay, when I've kind of run out of this idea, I'm going to go into a new idea in a new paragraph. So that volunteers are just normal, everyday individuals is emphasized by the farmer shirts seen in the accompanying image. All right. So it appears that rather than the fancy dress of a superhero suit, volunteers dress rather ordinarily. So we might expect if Bennett had given an image of volunteers that they would be in these sort of Batman suit or something. I mean, by the language she uses to describe them. And what's his name? Ewan do? He goes, no. We're just normal Australians wearing our jeans and our shirts. So the image suggests the following: that while volunteers appearing exceptional to some, such as Bennett, is just a function of the ability of multiple parties to band together to cooperate towards a common goal. So this is kind of a complex idea, but what I'm saying here is that Bennett thinks volunteers are really kind of heroic and perfect. But actually, she just thinks that because she doesn't realize that volunteers just band together, they work together, they cooperate. That's what makes them seem like heroes. That's what makes their capacities seem, so incredible what they do. And how could we live without these people? They're heroes. Well, no, they're just individuals in a community who have come together. So this idea that I just mentioned is symbolized by the various hands of different skin tone, representing different cultural backgrounds and gender. So we have the manicured fingernails of a female compared to the hairy arms of a man. They're joined together at a shared center. So we have the unification of different cultures, different backgrounds, and even the different sexes. We've got females and we've got males. So, thus, by providing an alternative explanation for why volunteers may appear so remarkable, Ewan suggests volunteering is an activity accessible to all human beings who cooperate together, thereby downplaying Bennett's I can never say this word, aggrandizement of volunteers. So Bennett's been aggrandizing volunteers, which basically just means kind of inflating their importance. Well, at least that's what Ewan implies by this image, that they're just cooperating together. All right, so that's the image analysis done, fair bit there. And then we just move on to the conclusion, which as always is a very simple, brief affair. Um, you do not need to worry about the conclusion, mainly because it's the least important aspect. So just diagnose a couple of the ways in which the writer advances their contention. So thus, while Bennett idealizes volunteers by positioning the audience to view them as heroes, Ewan undercuts her idealization by portraying volunteers as just ordinary human beings doing what is right. Not a particularly incredible conclusion, but the fact of the matter is, it you just don't really get many marks for it. All the marks you really get is in your analysis and the identification of the contention. So you want to spend all your time as much as possible as writing and doing your analysis. And this piece was fairly short. Oh, maybe not. Maybe 900, 1,000 words. But in any case, just remember that analysis is all just about what are the different suggestions and how does this affect the audience. If you can do those two steps over and over and over again, you are well on your way to smashing the exam. All right, till I see you guys in class.